مسيكم بالخير. أولا شكرا لسعادة السفير الإسرائيلي في واشنطن على هالمساج، الرسالة اللي قالها للبنانيين فيها نبل وأخلاق وكرامة. شكرا سعادة السفير. يا أخوان، الرئيس شيمون بيريز قال خلونا نشوف الحقيقة، نشوف الواقع. قال خلونا نشوف الواقع. قصة كتير بسيطة. أبو مازن محمود عباس ما بقى يمثل شيء. حسين الشيخ ما بقى في شيء اسمه سلطة فلسطينية، وحسين الشيخ لك ما بيمثل 1%. إذن على العرب النفط، عرب النفط العاقلين بدن يعني صايرة جرسة هيك يقعدوا ويتناقشوا بهدوء مع الإسرائيليين. عرب النفط هن اليوم الميزان القوي بين العرب، وإلا رايحين على محلات ما بتركب بالراس. يعني مثلا ما في دولة فلسطينية، خلونا نحكي غير شيء، ليه اليوم وليه ب500 مليون سنة ولا ب1000 مليون سنة، ما واردة. إذن خلونا نقعد عقال ونحكي. أنا طرحت قصة بسيطة كتير بدها عقول كبيرة، ناس دارسين قانون، دارسين دستور، ناجحين بحياتهم بهالمواضيع هيدي، يقعدوا ويدرسوا الكومنولث الإسرائيلي. سايكس بيكو ما بقى موجود واحد يحكي فيه، ما بقى له قيمة. ربحوا الحرب العالمية الأولى الفرنساوية والإنجليز وصنفوا مثل ما بدهم، ما بدها شيء. يعني نفس الشيء ميشيل عون ارتبط بالضحك على الناس، اخذ ملايين الدولارات معه على خصوصا اللي عطيه اياهم صدام حسين هيك التافه كمان بدون ما يفكر. فروح على باريس، عيش بباريس، يعني ما عيش بالصومال. ما هو مرته وبناته واسرته يعني راحوا ارتبطوا بحزب الله وعملوا هالثروات الضخمة الخيالية. ما حدا بده يترك لنا المصريات هيك، ما أنا واردة في دول لها دار كبير. فسايكس بيكون انتهى، عدوا نحكي غير شيء على العرب. مشان هيك، مشان نحطكم بالجو، إنكم تسمعوا هذا الكلام وأرجوكم تسمعوه، أنتم المثقفين المتعلمين. حتى سيمون كارون سمع، يعني القوات اللبنانية لازم يسمعوا هالشيء. القاضي المهم والكبير والمهم بيتر جيرمانوس لازم يسمعوا. الدكتور فارس بواز، فارس لبنان، فارس الكرامة، فارس الإنسان، فارس الحياة، ولد ببيت بيحبوا الناس وبيضحى، بيه وأمه ضحى من أجل بناء مستقبل أكتر، وضحوا يخدموا الناس بابتسامة وبحنان وبكل شيء. فلازم تسمعوا بالإنجليزي، اسمعوا وقولوا اللي بدكن اياه.
20 of them are on this topic. In your view, why do we not have... Why don't you tell me? You've written 58 books. I think 20 of them are on this topic. In your view, Why do we not have peace and coexistence between the river and the sea for the Arabs and the Jews?
Oh, for one very simple reason, and that is it has been concluded by Muslim clerics and by Arab leaders that there can never be a Jewish state, a nation state for the Jewish people. And the difference between Zionism and what I call Palestinianism is that Zionism was an attempt to build a country, whereas the opponents of Zionism are trying to undo a country and trying to make Palestine free from the river to the sea, which excludes Israel. But let me answer your question a little bit more broadly, because I don't think the Palestinian people are at fault for the failure to have a resolution here. Look, Israel deserved to have a state. Israel was a state just before the crucifixion of Jesus in Judea and Samaria. And there have been Jews living in what is now Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, since biblical times. There's never been a day when Israel has been Judenrein. There have been times when there have been...
It's a German word for free of Jews.
Free of Jews. There have been times when the number of Jews have been small, but if you even go back to the 1820 census, the first census that based on religion, found out that there was a majority of Jews in Jerusalem. Second, by the way, were Christians, and third were Muslims. 1947, when the UN partitioned the British Mandate and allocated for a Jewish state areas only that had a Jewish majority. Remember, the area that was supposed to be a Jewish state was a sliver on the coast with the Negev, which nobody really wanted. Earlier on, when the first resolution was proposed by the Peel Commission, the Negev was allocated to an Arab state. But in 47, 48, under that resolution, there would have been two states, one with a Jewish majority. There was a Jewish majority in Tel Aviv, half and half in Haifa, and a Jewish, if not majority, plurality in Jerusalem. And that area to be allocated to a Jewish state had a Jewish majority, and the area allocated for an Arab state, the word Palestinian was never mentioned in these dialogues, had an Arab majority. And the head of the Arab group in what is now called Palestine, Haj al-Husseini, said, no, we don't want a state. We want there not to be a Jewish state. And then so in 1948, Israel declared statehood. And there was no Nakba, there were no immigration, there was no dispersal of Arab peoples. Had the Palestinians said yes, by the way, Mahmoud Abbas has said the refusal of the Arab leaders to accept the two-state solution in 48 was a great sin and a great disaster, and many Arab leaders have joined that. And so there could have been a Palestinian state 1948 easily, but there wasn't. And all the Arab countries then invaded Israel. And as a result of that, Arabs were thrown out of Israel and Jews were thrown out of Arab countries. There was essentially an exchange of population. Approximately 700 were out of Israel, some voluntarily, many non-voluntarily, and about the same number of Jews from North African and other states.
I recently purchased the most popular glucose meter online and decided to test it with you. If you have diabetes or know anyone dealing with it, you understand how annoying finger pricking can be. The Glucomax changes everything. It's a needle-free glucose meter boasting 99.9% accuracy. All I did was place my finger...
And then the interesting point is between 48, let me just finish, I'm almost done. Between 48 and 67, the only barrier to the Arabs, the Palestinians, having a state was Jordan and Egypt. After all, Israel didn't control what is now called the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Those were controlled by Egypt and by Jordan. The Palestinians didn't seek a state from Jordan and from Egypt. They only sought statehood once there was a state of Israel in an attempt to do away with the state of Israel. And so it's an asymmetrical issue. Once a state wants to live in peace in a state, and the other group wants to destroy that state. And if there ever came a time, and I've had dinner with Abbas, we've sat across the table and I'm sitting, next to you. And I said to him, he said to me, why don't you call your friend Netanyahu and ask him to recognize Palestine? And I said, I'll do that if I can also tell him that you would recognize Israel as a Jewish state or as the nation state of the Jewish people. And he said he couldn't do that. And so the main reason we're here tonight is because of the refusal to recognize a nation state of the Jewish people. And I want to throw a challenge out to all of you. Any of you who have heard the protests and seen the protests, has anybody heard any of the protesters at Harvard or any other place call for a two-state solution? Maybe you have. I have not. It's always a call for Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, but not for a two-state solution. So I think the key to the continuing conflict is the asymmetry between those who are prepared to accept a nation state of the Jewish people and those who don't think that that's consistent with either Muslim religious tenets or Arab or Palestinian political tenets.
There's a lot of history that you very deftly, I think, summarized, but I want to pick at a few things. So the first point you made, which I think is totally incontrovertible, which is that the Jewish people have always had a connection to the land that we now call Israel.
It's not New Zealand.
It's not New Zealand.
Right.
It's
So
not, you know.
colonialism is not really the proper word.
Well, hold up. We'll come to all that. Okay, you're destroying my plan. Okay, so it would be curious to. I mean, I think that the state of Israel. Let me just state this at the outset: is as legitimate as any other state that exists today. I think that legitimacy derives from a vote of the international community about 80 years ago. I am not somebody who gets who takes his foreign policy beliefs from holy texts or from ancient history. So for me, you spend a lot of time trying to show that the state of Israel is not settler, it's not colonial, etc. Your diagnosis of the problem is Palestinian rejectionism. But you've basically compressed 80 years of history into a moment. When the Palestinians or the Arabs during the Mandate period rejected the various partition plan, right, was that because they were unremittent anti-Semites who just couldn't accept a Jewish state? Or was it because, look, these are people who were living in this land during the Ottoman Empire, and then suddenly the Ottoman Empire loses World War I, the British take over, and they start encouraging immigration mainly from Europe, the Jews of Europe who are fleeing terrible conditions. The Palestinians look around themselves and they're like, our country is really changing. And just like Americans who don't like massive immigration, these Arabs didn't like this massive immigration and were trying to halt it. In other words, it doesn't take, them being anti-Semitic. It just takes them being normal human beings, trying to preserve what they had. What's wrong? What am I getting wrong there?
I agree with you. It wasn't anti-Semitism. I think it was a narrow view of region and land, and there was room for two peoples on land that had origins that were very, very focused on those people's history. You talk about Israel being established 80 yees ago. No, it was established over hundreds and hundreds of years. The first Zionists were writing in the middle of the 19th century. I have a little pin that I have here, which is 1917, the first Zionist conference in Russia. Jews have been attached to Israel from the beginning of history. It's not
no question.
It's not just that they came there, but then an event occurred, a horrible event occurred. It was called World War II, genocide and the Holocaust. And the Holocaust had two aspects of it. One we all know about, and that is the Nazis determined to engage in an act of genocide, which is to ingather Jews from anywhere they could find them in the world, from the island of Rhodes, from anywhere else, in order to gas them and murder them and kill them and eliminate the genetic component of Jewishness. That was one part of the Holocaust we all know about. The other part, which was central to the establishment of Israel, was that no country in the world would accept Jewish refugees who were trying to escape the Holocaust. the Minister of Absorption in Canada put it very well when he said, and there's a book by this name, even one is too many. Even one is too many. So no country, not the United States, not France, not Great Britain, not any country would accept Jews. And so is it surprising that when after 6 million Jews are killed and Jews, hundreds of thousands, are in camps in Europe, in Italy and in Austria, homeless, they had lost their homes all through Europe. By the way, not without some fault by Arab leaders. Hajj al-Husseini, the Arab leader of the Palestinians, spent the war years with Hitler in Berlin planning the genocide of the rest of the Jewish world and tried very hard to build gas chambers actually in Israel. So in any event, you have a situation where the world recognizes that here's a people, an ancient people, that need a homeland, and they have a majority in areas that have never been a state before. There's never been a state in what is today Israel or Palestine. And so very logically, the Peel Commission and the United Nations says, let's do what seems sensible. Let's allow the Jews to establish a state so they can bring in people that they want to bring in on areas where they're a majority, Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and let's leave the Arabs who are in a majority of the rest of the area alone to be the farmers, to live their lives, two separate states. They don't have to have any interaction with each other, or they could if you want them to. You might ultimately build some kind of a federation, who knows? But you can explain the Arab rejection of the Jewish state just on the ground of how so many Americans don't want immigrants to come into the country. But
I want to put a pin in a couple of things. Sure. First, we're not going to have time to talk about it. People should Google it. You mentioned Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who had been appointed basically by the British to be
by a Jew, by a Jew named Samuels. Yes. Jews can be really, really stupid.
To be the head of the.
This was one who was.
To be the head of the Arab community in Palestine.
Right.
And you're right that he spent the war in Germany. Where I would disagree with you is that transfers an iota of responsibility for the Holocaust to the Palestinians.
Wrong, because every home in Palestine had pictures of the Grand Mufti when he was spending the time in Germany.
I don't think that's true.
We could argue about that, but the Grand Mufti is still a very popular leader today,
not because
among Palestinians.
I think not because of his activities during World War II. I think
that's by saying Hitler was not popular because he wanted to kill Jews.
Hitler.
He was popular because he created employment.
Alan,
I'm not absolving Hitler.
What do you say to somebody? Yes, you are. You're kind of.
Hitler wanted to kill the Jews. I've read Mein Kampf. I know all the history. And then this man joined him. He had no real impact. He had no real impact.
Agreed.
But he clearly showed the mindset of the leadership, the man who was the leader of the Palestinian movement at the time, joining with Hitler. But that's not the important point. The important point is that there was a problem. And the world, the international community, solved the problem in a reasonable manner, requiring both sides to compromise. Do you know the debate that occurred over the Peel Commission report and the UN division within the Israelis, within the Jewish community? Most of them were opposed to it. They said, we don't want this little sliver of land, but we'll take it. But the Palestinians would not compromise.
Well, and you wrote a great book called The Case for Israel in 2003, where you lay out in a very organized way your arguments or your rejoinder to many of the arguments against Israeli positions. So I just want to try to bring us back closer to the present. You spend a lot of time talking about Camp David in 2000.
That's right.
That, in your view, that was a critical moment where everything went wrong.
Absolutely.
Okay. And if I could, just because I want to, get to the present day quickly, tell me if I'm mischaracterizing your argument. Your argument is that at Camp David, which was a negotiation between brokered by President Bill Clinton between Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, and Yasser Arafat, then the leader of the Palestinians. The Israelis made a very generous offer to the Palestinians, and Yasser Arafat refused to accept it because he was, like Haj Amin al-Husseini, just ultimately unable to reconcile himself to the reality of accepting Jewish sovereignty.
Also, he was afraid that he'd be killed the way the grandfather of the current king of Jordan. But let me call as my witness, because I'm a lawyer. Let me call as my witness the eyewitness, a man named William Jefferson Clinton, who I remember listening to him speak right here. Let me read to you what he said about the Camp David Accord. The only time Yasser Arafat didn't tell me the truth was when he promised he was going to accept the peace deal that we had worked out, which would have given the Palestinians a state on 96% of the West Bank and 4% of Israel. For any of you who can't add, you know the old joke about the student who's in Central Square and he goes to the supermarket and it says 10 items only and he has 12, and the woman from the middle of Central Square says, "Are you from MIT? And you can't read, or Harvard, and you can't count." But you can count. So you can count. 96 plus 4% is 100%. Plus, I'm just going to continue to read. And they got to choose where the 4% of Israel was. So they would have the effect of the same land in all the West Bank. They would have a capital in East Jerusalem. All this was offered, including a capital in East Jerusalem and 2 of the 4 quadrants of the old city of Jerusalem, confirmed by the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and his cabinet. And they said no. I think part of it is that Hamas did not care about a homeland for the Palestinians. They wanted to kill Israelis and make Israel uninhabitable. And then a little later he says, when you walk away from a deal, this is Clinton, when you walk away from a deal like that, you can't come back in 20 years and say you want it now. So yes, that's my position, that in 2000, there was an offer on the table that could have resolved this issue. I was involved in helping give advice on that, and I was rooting very hard for people to accept it. I went to Israel, I lobbied people, and ultimately Arafat thought he would be killed if he accepted it by radical Palestinians, and thought he would be giving up the rights of the Palestinian people by having a 2-state solution. That's what it would have been, a 2-state solution. Yeah. So yes, 2000 was a critical turning point in my mind and in the mind of many other people, but we can't go back, tragically.
Let me offer you an alternative history, and then you tell me what I'm getting wrong.
Okay.
The first argument is that, so Professor Dershowitz is presenting this as a moment, okay? Yeah. Camp David, summer of 2000, Palestinians are given the best possible deal that Ehud Barak can offer, and they walk away from it. And by the way, I have no brief for Yasser Arafat. If you take my class, you'll hear worse things about Yasser Arafat than you'll hear from Professor Dershowitz. But in this particular instance, first of all, Palestinians didn't want to go to Camp David. There was a negotiation that was happening behind the scenes. I believe it was in Stockholm. They were getting somewhere. The Americans, I think because Clinton wanted to cement his legacy, instead tried to corral them into this negotiation. The Palestinians didn't want to show up. Clinton, according to Arafat, Clinton says to Arafat, just come, do your best. I promise I won't blame you if it fails. The Palestinians show up. Do they agree to the deal? No. But is there a piece of paper offered to the Palestinians? Is there a written agreement offered to them? Not.
Sounds like a lawyer's argument to me.
Hold on, Alan. I'm just trying to get you to admit that the catastrophe is mutually created.
No, I won't admit it, and I'm not your brother. The Palestinians had an opportunity to have a state during the Peel Commission in 1947. 1948, 1964, 2000, 2001, 2007, and they blew it every single time. This is not mutual. The Israelis wanted a 2-state solution. Now many of them don't. They don't have trustworthiness. But they wanted it, and they were prepared to give up a great deal. And the Clinton parameters were acceptable to most Israelis. And Arafat simply refused to accept them because he feared for his own life. So no, I don't think the fault is in any way mutual. I think that it lies 95% on the side of the Palestinian leaders, not the Palestinian people, the Palestinian leaders, and 5% on behalf of the Israeli leaders. But what's the use of allocating responsibility? Let's see how we can move forward.
Okay, let's talk about
moving forward.
Let's talk about moving forward.
Okay.
So you, we're obviously right now in the middle of a war, and you just published an article in the Wall Street Journal entitled "Israel has proved that Jewish blood is no longer cheap."
The article that you asked me about tries to explain why Israel has changed its rules of engagement in this war. And it goes back in history, and it demonstrates how cheap human blood was for so many centuries. Jewish blood was for so many centuries. And this was an attempt to try to make it clear to the enemies of the people who conducted October 7th. To remember, the recent events didn't grow out of a vacuum. They grew out of the greatest massacre of Jews, rapes, murders, beheadings since the Holocaust. And Israel had to send a message that Jewish life is not cheap and that you pay a heavy cost when you take Jewish life in this way. Having said that, they still had the best ratio in the history of modern warfare, the best ratio of civilian to combatant deaths of any country fighting a terrorist war. Even if you take only Hamas's figures and totally ignore all of Israeli figures, every single one of them, you still get a ratio of less than 3 to 1. That is 3 civilians for every combatant. The NATO ratio is approximately 7 to 1. The ratio of other countries that have fought terrorist wars of this kind is more like 10. To 1. Israel goes to such enormous efforts to try to reduce civilian casualties, not because they're such wonderful, terrific, great people, because it benefits them to reduce civilian casualties. Every time a civilian dies, it hurts their cause tremendously, and it helps the Palestinian cause tremendously. So Israel has every incentive to minimize the number of civilian casualties. And have they done an effective job? They could do a better job. Of course they can. You can second guess almost any military action. And what they've done is they said they're going to get every terrorist. They're going to get everyone who participated in the October 7th massacres. And have they overdone it? Reasonable people could argue that they have. Israel's a democracy. As you know, every single Saturday night, there are demonstrations against Israel and against the Israeli leadership. Israel is a vibrant democracy, and it will change when there are elections, and you're going to see it make, obviously, overreactions to events like October 7th. Who would not have an overreaction to October 7th? You think the United States didn't have an overreaction to Pearl Harbor? You think the United States didn't have overreactions to other kinds of events that occurred? Of course you do in history. And that's what a democracy is all about. You can't, what I argued in my op-ed, is you can't understand Israel's actions today out of the context of history. That Jewish life has been so cheap. During the Holocaust, for example, we know how many Jews were killed and how few Germans actually paid the price for it. Germany was rebuilt by the Marshall Plan almost immediately. Japan was rebuilt by the comparable to the Marshall Plan. And the perpetrators of the Holocaust, some of the hands-on people, were persecuted, prosecuted, but others were not. And I think for many Israelis, October 7th marked a very important day. And they said, look, we're not going to allow Jewish life to be cheap. We're going to have to respond, and we're going to respond forcefully. We're going to not target civilians. And I challenge you or anybody else to find me one instance where the Israeli army deliberately targeted a civilian with no military function and no military goal and wasn't punished for it. Why wouldn't they be punished for it? What does Israel benefit when it kills a civilian, when it kills a child, when it kills a woman? It only loses when that happens. Sometimes it's necessary. When you have 25 terrorists hiding in the basement of a hospital or hiding in the basement of a school, using civilians as human shields, then the Israeli army has two choices. Let them continue to stay there and operate and kill Israelis, or make a cost-benefit calculus. And the law has created an algorithm for evaluating that legally. is called the rule of proportionality. That is, every country has an obligation, every military, to look at the military value of the target, analyze how many potential civilians could be killed or hurt by the attack on the target, and then come to a conclusion that the military value of the attack is warranted by the number of collateral civilian injuries or deaths. That's the law of war, and that's the law that every country operates under. Some do it with more sensitivity to civilian life, some do it with less sensitivity, but that's the law. It doesn't say you can't ever kill a civilian. If it said that, then every country would just use civilians as human shields and preclude themselves from being ever defeated militarily.
Professor.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I think, it bears repeating that October 7th was a great crime, not just against the Jewish people, a crime against humanity.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah.
And absolutely the state of Israel was justified in attacking Hamas as a result of what happened on October 7th. What we are talking about is whether things have gone too far.
I agree with you. Reasonable people could disagree.
Alan, I'm going to give you the chance to chop my head off, but let me just put the claim.
I was just acceding to your point.
So hold on. Let me make my point. But you did say, why would Israel want to kill civilians?
That's right.
So this summer, Israeli Channel 12 broadcast a rationale offered by the former head of Israeli military intelligence for why you might want to kill civilians after something as horrific as October 7th. Mm-hmm. He said, the fact that there are already 50,000 dead in Gaza is necessary and required for future generations. Okay, he's speaking here to Hamas. Okay, you humiliated, you slaughtered, you murdered. It's all true. The price for everything that happened on 7th of October, for every one person killed on 7th of October, 50 Palestinians have to die. Never mind if they're children. I'm not speaking out of revenge. I'm talking about a message for future generations. That's how it is. They need a Nakba from time to time to feel the price.
That's dead wrong. I absolutely condemn that kind of thinking at all. It's never, ever appropriate to target a civilian for death. Now, let me tell you, there's a lot of precedent for doing it. Winston Churchill, we know from his memoirs, wanted to destroy Dresden and wanted to kill civilians because, and then he wrote about it after the war, because he said that only by killing civilians will we turn the German population against the Nazi party. And so they firebombed Dresden, they firebombed Hamburg, they made massive attacks on Berlin. Obviously, the United States firebombed Tokyo, killing many hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And that's been done. Israel doesn't do that. And it's never done that. It always, however, tries to get the perpetrators. Now, if the perpetrators are hiding in hospitals and schools, and if it is part of the Hamas policy, and you don't have to believe me on this, I can give you 10 sources, and you won't disagree with this, from Hamas leaders saying our civilians are shaheeds, our civilians are martyrs. They should die in order to make it harder for Israel to attack our soldiers. Let me give you one other fact that hardly ever gets reported. Hamas refuses to allow any civilians into its tunnels. Its tunnels are bomb-proof.
Yeah.
Its tunnels protect civilians.
Protect military.
No, it could protect civilians. Protects the military, but it has restricted the tunnels and said only Hamas members go into the tunnels. The rest of you civilians, you have to stay above ground and absorb the bombs that Israel is going to send in order to kill Hamas members.
Yes.
So that's part of Hamas's policy. Then the other part is it takes its fighters and it embeds them among civilians. Just now, that's happening today. You saw that the administration today, the United States administration, announced that if Hamas continues to use human shields in Gaza today, they will have to pay a heavy price for it. Yeah. Now, I don't necessarily agree with everything the administration has said about that, but you have to at least, and I'm going to ask you this question directly, allocate some, most, all, I'll let you pick multiple choice, some, most, all of the responsibility for dead civilians with Hamas using civilians
Oh,
as human shields.
100%. But
Why are we arguing?
no, here's what we're arguing about. First of all, look, we've seen that the state of Israel has incredible capabilities to launch targeted attacks.
Yeah, but they failed on October 7th. They're not perfect.
Yeah, clearly. But they could have targeted Hamas leadership in a much more precise
They
way.
tried in Qatar, and they failed.
Yeah. Well, I would have liked some more trying of that kind, as opposed to
I agree with you.
the absolute carnage that we have now.
I agree with you.
Today, this summer, more than 500 senior Israeli military and national security officials wrote a letter to President Trump saying, we need you to pressure Netanyahu to stop this war. There are no more strategic objectives to be gained here. One of the signatories of that letter was Ehud Olmert, who says that what's happening right now in Gaza is indiscriminate killing. What are those people getting wrong that Alan Dershowitz knows and they don't?
Well, Ehud Olmert is a very close friend of mine. I visit with him whenever I go to Israel. He visits with me when he comes to America. I like him very much. He is dead wrong. He has BDS. What is BDS? Bibi derangement syndrome. He hates Bibi Netanyahu with such a passion that he's prepared to make these kinds of outrageous, preposterous statements about Israel. He's just dead wrong about that. Israel will do everything in its power to avoid civilian casualties if they can get at Hamas fighters.
Yeah.
But they will resolve doubts. And the big difference, and that's the article I wrote, the big difference after October 7th, they're more likely to resolve doubts in a way that increases the proportion of civilians to terrorists that are killed. That's been a change.
Okay, put Ehud Olmert aside. What about the 550 other signatories of that letter, including, Boogie Alon, including...
They're all friends of mine, and they all hate Netanyahu with a passion. And
these are fierce warriors on behalf of the Jewish state. These are not just partisan politicians.
There are 5 times as many fierce warriors who take the opposite position. But that's why you have a democracy in Israel. These people have the right to make their position known, and they do on television, and they do in the media. And there'll be elections. There have been how many? 6 elections in the last 9 years in Israel? What other country has had more democratic responses to this than Israel? And these people will be listened to. They'll be listened to by some. They will not be listened to by others. And ultimately, the people of Israel will make very, very difficult decisions. And I don't deny that emotions are involved in this. When you have what happened on October 7th, rapes, beheadings, murders, children murdered in front of their parents, parents murdered in front of their children, not only Hamas people doing the murders, but ordinary citizens of Gaza crossing the border themselves and participating in these events, and then polls showing that the vast majority of people in Gaza and on the West Bank supported October 7th and want it to happen again and again and again. Do you expect Israelis, just because they're Jews, to be super rational and not influenced by emotions? Of course they're going to be influenced by emotions, and of course there are going to be overreactions, and of course political figures are going to take advantage of the overreaction. That's why you have votes.
Fair enough. I would submit to you, though, that the polling data that you just cited, which I'm not totally familiar with, might also reflect an emotional reaction on the part of Palestinians
I agree.
to the bombardment of Gaza.
So I agree. By the way, it's interesting. Let me give you a fact that you don't know about. That is a much higher percentage of West Bankers, Arabs, Palestinians who have not been bombed, support what Hamas did than people in Gaza. The people in Gaza have understood the consequences that, when you attack Jews, when you attack Israel, and by the way, not only Jews were attacked on October 7th, Thai people were attacked, Christians were attacked, many were attacked. When you make that kind of a brutal, gruesome attack, there's going to be an emotional reaction to it, and there's going to be an overreaction to it, and that's why I don't think you can take the position that my friend Ehud Olmert takes. Ehud Olmert is furious because he went to prison. By the way, talk about, the International Criminal Court is allowed to go after any country only under the issue of complementarity. You can only go after a country if it doesn't have a legal system that's willing and able to go after its leaders. Witness 1, Ehud Olmert. I went to visit him in prison. I saw him in prison. He was there. He was sentenced to prison as an Israeli prime minister. The president of Israel was sentenced to prison. And so Israel certainly has a judicial system that's capable of administering justice when there are overreactions. And there have been people who have been prosecuted. When's the last time Hamas or any Arab state or any Palestinian group has ever held their own people accountable for overreaction? It's a double standard.
Well, let's talk about moving forward. And I take that point.
Okay.
Yeah. So, over the summer, the Saudis and the French put forward a proposal that there would be an international-led reconstruction of Gaza, but it requires the war to end. Okay, it requires the war to end.
The war should end.
So would you go to Benjamin Netanyahu and say, this ground campaign in Gaza, you should stop, just declare victory and leave?
No, but I would go to Benjamin Netanyahu, and I have gone to Benjamin Netanyahu, and I plan to go to him again in November and say, you have to figure out a way of ending this war quickly and decisively, and in a way that makes sure that Hamas doesn't maintain control over Gaza. The United States would never have ended the war with Germany if the Nazi Party maintained control over Germany, or we would never have accepted the surrender in Japan if the Imperial Japanese remained in control. Hamas has the controlling influence on this. Let them lay down their arms, let them release the hostages, and then let there be peace. And Israelis are divided as to whether or not they should go into Gaza City. Reasonable people are that's what a democracy is about.
Understood, Alan.
I grew up during the Vietnam War, and I know how divided a country can be.
Yeah.
We were wrong in Vietnam, and it's possible that Israel is wrong in Gaza. Yeah. But in a democracy, decisions aren't made by professors at the Institute of Politics, and they're not made in these debates. They're made by the people, and you get all the information. And the one thing you can't deny is that Israel is the most open society with the most critical newspapers. Haaretz has never said anything positive about Netanyahu, and the Israelis have the ability to make decisions about their own future, and we shouldn't be making it for them, but even if they make mistakes.
Well, no, but we are Americans, and our country gives a lot of aid to Israel. We are allies of Israel.
Right.
It's okay for us to talk about whether Israeli policy makes sense, whether it's...
I completely agree, as long as we don't impose anything on them.
Yeah, Tariq Massoud is going to impose something on Israel. But we're having a discussion here.
Yes,
so the point that, Israel is going to make a decision...
You've asked me to impose it on Benjamin Netanyahu.
I've asked you the following question. What is the problem? What are the Saudis and the French and those 550 Israeli national security figures getting wrong when they say the following? End the war right now. Hamas is effectively new. I have so many other questions to ask you.
I got so many other answers.
I know. But I am obligated to open the floor to our audience.
Yeah.
My question specifically is about suffering, which has not been spoken in this room. We're gesturing to it. We're talking about history. But I love the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote. The logic of the lived experience of law is not logic, it is experience. Right. The current experience of suffering, and in particular, the gendered nature of it, what is your personal accountability to suffering? It's not just what Hamas and everyone else can do, but as a Jew who serves the God of Hesa, what is your personal responsibility in addressing and ending suffering? And I object to two things when I could have objected to so many things you said. We're all an ancient people. And the women of Israel would object that it's the most open society. I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Okay, first for the last question. No reasonable person, regardless of their gender, could deny that Israel is the most open society in the Middle East, and I would submit the most open society in the world today. I don't think there is a country that holds a candle to Israel.
The United States of America.
No,
absolutely.
No, there is much more. There's much more self-imposed censorship in the United States of America, much more cancellation, much more attempts to, I'll give you that. Okay, so the United States and Israel are tied. and maybe Scandinavia, but to say that Israel is not an open society, I mean, have you been to Israel? I want to ask you, you asked me the question. Have you been to Israel?
No, listen,
have you been
Alan,
Yeah.
let's, okay, point taken. Can I answer something on your behalf? One of
You can try.
When studying Alan Dershowitz, I watched movies about him. I found a debate that he had 40 years ago here in Boston with Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was an extremist, the founder of the Jewish Defense League,
right,
the founder of a political party called the Kach Party, that's the precursor to the Otzmat Yehudit Party that is led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. And Professor Dershowitz condemned Kahane for his belief in the necessity of targeting civilians in order to deter attacks against Jews.
I still take the same position.
So I do.
I think you deserve against it.
Yeah, I think you deserve a great credit for that. Okay, so let's take another question, and I'll come over here.
Hi, thanks both for coming in. I'm a senior at the college. I had a question. I actually was about to reference that same debate as well in 1985. And I saw that, I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, that Meir Kahane would have identified his affinity with Israel through some sort of religious or ethnic solidarity, whereas I assume you're on a more political level. Would that be correct?
Well, I had a big debate with Meir Kahane, and he called me a racist. Why did he call me a racist? He said, do you believe that God commands you to do whatever it was he commands? And I said, I'm an agnostic. I'm a skeptic. I have no idea whether there's a God. I'm like Thomas Jefferson. Maybe, I hope someday. Wouldn't it be nice if there were a heaven? And wouldn't it be nice if I qualified for heaven? That's less likely. But wouldn't all that be nice? But I don't know any of these things. And so I can't to tell you what. Remind me again, what was the thrust of it?
The thrust of it was, would there be a policy passed or a legislative change that would make you stop supporting Israel altogether?
Excellent question. What would make you stop supporting Israel? Thank you.
What would make me stop supporting Israel is if Israel started doing things that violated my principles of morality, if they started doing things that targeted innocent civilians. I would have difficulty because I would want to know who I was joining in condemning Israel.
Yeah.
I'd want to know how it would be used. I've been very critical of Israel. I've written very critically of Israel. The Case for Peace has a lot of elements in it that are very critical of Israel. And I got a bunch of Israelis who boycotted me, including my uncle. My uncle, who was a professor at Bar-Ilan University, walked out on an honorary degree ceremony that I was given at Bar-Ilan University because I was too critical of Israel. Being an advocate of the two-state solution already puts me, if not on the left, at least in the center. So I'll admit, I start with a presumption. I am Jewish. I am not religious particularly. I have to apologize to Rabbi Zarki here, but I have to tell the truth. I am not religious, so I love to go to his services and love to go to Hillel. Chabad. Occasionally to Chabad and to Hillel. I have a leap of faith. Occasionally, like in the middle of the night, I'll get up and say, I can't understand how this could have happened without some intervention. I have moments. But my support for Israel is not ethnocentric or religious. I think I would be a supporter of Israel if I were a Christian, if I were a Muslim, if I were a Jew, if I were brought up as a very anti-Israel Muslim. I don't know whether I could break that or not. But my support for Israel is based on my 86 years of principled defense of the values that I support, and Israel reflects that better than its enemies.
What about settlements? Settlements a policy that you would?
No, I don't. 1970.
We need to get our money up. So then when I was getting my money up through my Wealthfront account, I told her she also has to. I referred Linda to Wealthfront. She does inspire me to save more. I'm on track to save for things like my family and friends.
Our automatic fuel delivery means you'll never run out of heat. Budget-friendly options and flexible service plans fit every family's needs. For over
I debated in this very room or its predecessor, Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky had been my camp counselor in 1948, the year Israel was established. And at that point, I stated my strong opposition to settlements, and it continues. I was a big supporter of what was called the Alon Plan. Yeah. Alon wanted to simply annex very small parts of the West Bank, mostly unpopulated, in order to secure Israel's security, but was against. So I've been against the settlements right from the beginning. I continue to oppose the settlements. I do think they are not the kind of barriers to peace that people think they were. Proof of that is Gaza. There were 9,000 Jews who were settlers. They had buried their dead in northern Gaza. And when Sharon decided to end Israeli presence in Gaza, 9,000 Jews were forcibly removed from Gaza and resettled. And I think that could happen as well in the West Bank.
Let's take another question, please.
Gentlemen, thank you again for your insight. I've appreciated hearing both sides of everything you've said. My question is regarding the current push. I guess this would be on the Israeli side for a one-state solution. And if that were to be the case, how do you envision the Palestinians coming on, whether it be they would be given equal rights? Would it be a kind of second-class citizen type thing? Or are we looking at a civil rights movement similar to the South in the 60s? I'd love to hear both you guys.
A good question.
How that would work out.
I am categorically opposed to a one-state solution. I think as a lawyer, sometimes a good divorce is much better than a bad marriage. And trying to force the Palestinians into the same state as the Israelis would only be a prescription for disaster. Who gets access to Israeli military, to nuclear weapons, to their science? I want to see a two-state solution. Don't want to see it as a reward for what Hamas did on October 7th. I want to see it as a process that has to take time, and it has to involve appropriate governance of the West Bank and Gaza with elections and security guarantees for both sides. But I'm not in favor of a one-state solution any more than I would have been in Lebanon. By the way, when I debated Chomsky, he was in favor of the one-state solution, and I pointed out Lebanon was a state, and look what happened. It fell into disaster. Yugoslavia. How many of you remember the word Yugoslavia? Today, how many states comprise what used to be Yugoslavia? So this forcing to India, Pakistan. No, I don't want to see groups of people that have very, very different backgrounds forced together. Having said that, I have tremendous admiration for the Palestinian people. I have met many of them. I have interacted with them. I have spent lots of time on the West Bank. I even spent time in Gaza. I actually have tremendous affinity for the Palestinian people. And I would love nothing more than to see them get good leadership and make peace with Israel and allow Israel and the Palestinians to live side by side. It would be an enormous contribution to humanity, because working together, Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims, could be a tremendous force for scientific development, for peaceful development. So maybe I'm an optimist, but that's my goal.
But that's why I call you my brother. Okay, next.
Hi. So we've talked a lot about ending the war, about suffering, but I think we've yet to actually talk about what this catastrophe actually is, and it is a genocide, as you guys said at the beginning. Yesterday, a former Israeli military chief recognized that more than 10% of Gaza's population has been killed by Israel. That is at least 65,000 confirmed deaths, though many believe the total is actually closer to 680,000. Over 70% of those deaths are women and children. All of Gaza is living under famine at the hands of Israel. 90% of schools are gone. 94% of hospitals are gone. Every single church and mosque is gone. And over 2/3 of all of the buildings in Gaza are destroyed. I have seen children burning to death with their limbs hanging off on my phone screen. So my question for you is simply, how could you, and how do you defend this?
If it were true, if it had any basis in reality, I obviously wouldn't defend it. By Hamas's own figures, the number of people killed in Gaza, including combatants and non-combatants, would be somewhere between 1% and 2%. That's not a genocide. When 1 or 2% of the people are killed, Israel could easily have engaged in a genocide if it chose to, the way the Nazis engaged in a genocide. Look, all of this could come to an end. It was started by Hamas. Remember, there was a peace treaty, a ceasefire. There was an agreed upon end of hostilities on October 6th. And Hamas decided that because there was a fear that maybe some of the Arab countries would start recognizing Israel, they decided they had to put an end to that. And so they invaded Israel, and they invaded areas of Israel that were mostly populated by peaceniks, by people who had helped the Palestinians from Gaza, people who favored a two-state solution, and they massacred them, and they raped them, and they beheaded them. And I didn't hear any mention of that in your question. And the question is the appropriate response. If Hamas were to lay down its arms and release the hostages, not a single Palestinian would die.
Yeah.
Not a single child would die. And so the burden, at least part of the burden, is on Hamas. Do the right thing and you will help your people.
Okay, let's take another question. Over here, please.
Yeah, hello. My name is Ophir. I'm from Israel. I'm a PhD student here in the economics department. You talked about the cost of life, like the cheapness of life, of Jewish lives. And a lot of people talk about the ratio between, like you mentioned, between the number of civilian versus combatant deaths. I'm thinking about events such as when the GHF was running most of the...
I missed what you
The
said.
Gaza Humanitarian.
When the Gaza Humanitarian Fund was running most of the, or all of the aid, there were like multiple reports that every single day, dozens of civilians who lined up to receive aid were killed by Israeli soldiers. And in many of those cases, the IDF did not deny this, but they said that this was something that was necessary for the forces on the ground, the IDF soldiers, to keep themselves safe from sort of approaching crowds. And it's not that the soldiers believed that they were combatants, but rather it was a measure of crowd control. So kind of thinking about this and remembering that all the children, the thousands of children who died in Gaza are not responsible for what Hamas, the terrible things that Hamas did. What would you say, and what do you think that the Israeli public would say if we could choose between the way that the war has been fought so far, as opposed to a war where instead of 50,000 civilians, only 10,000 civilians died, but then instead of 1,000 soldiers dying, maybe 2,000 or 5,000 Israeli soldiers would have died? How do you compare the cost of the life of the Israeli soldier to that of the life of the Gazan child?
Okay, so I used to teach a course at Harvard College called Where Does Your Morality Come From? It was freshman seminar, and that would have been a perfect question. How do you evaluate in a democracy the life of your soldiers versus the life of enemy civilians? That question was asked by many Americans right after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because the American estimate, the military estimate, was that if they hadn't dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if instead the American army had invaded the Japanese islands, 100,000 American soldiers would have died. And instead, 200,000 Japanese, mostly civilians, died. And, you know, this is a great moral issue. We have sitting in the front row here one of the great moralists of literally the 21st and 20th century, Steve Pinker. I'd love to hear him analyze the comparative morality. These are hard questions. These are the kinds of questions that we love to present to students and faculty members. Steve and I used to teach a course together called Taboo. We had 1,000 students asking questions like that. And it's impossible. My only point is, when you have hard questions like that, just understand the complexity and understand the nuance and understand that in life and in war and in the fog of war, there are no simple solutions. So it's a great question to which there is no perfect answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he was trying to introduce a philosophical debate. I mean, I think I know what his answer to it is. My trouble with the analogy with Japan is that, you know, it's almost this cartoon vision of Gaza that, you know, that was a state and the leadership of Gaza, Hamas, represented its people. It was the expression of the will of the Gazan people, and it attacked a neighboring state. When in fact, we know Hamas is a religious mafia that has basically been keeping the people of Gaza hostage since 2007.
Who would win an election in Gaza today?
I'll tell you something. right before October 7th, in the summer of 2023, there were protests against Hamas in Gaza. No, I don't think it would be Hamas. There were protests against Hamas in Gaza that summer.
There's always going to be protests.
And you know what? Those protests would have been bigger, and they would have come earlier if Benjamin Netanyahu hadn't been funding Hamas with bags of cash from Qatar. I'll take a question here. Go ahead.
Hassan? Hey. So first of all, thank you for coming. And next week is the Jewish New Year, so Shana Tova to you and your family. I want to ask regarding facts. The conversation was very fact-based. Lots of years, and they rejected this, rejected that. At the end of the day, we like to think that facts don't care about our feelings, but really we live in an age where feelings don't care about our facts. And you can see by social media that there's lots of trends, and public opinion is actually influenced not necessarily by what someone can consider to be the truth. In an age of misinformation, how do we combat that?
It's very hard. And look, I'm 87 years old. I can't go to the Middle East and have a kinetic impact on what's going on. All I can do is write my books and write my articles and write my op-eds. And what I'm trying to do is just persuade students, particularly in universities around the country, and particularly at Harvard, this is a complex issue. This is not an issue for demonstrations and sit-ins and disruptions of classes. This is a complicated issue that's ripe for discussion. That's why I'm so pleased that the Institute of Politics and that you conducted this and conducted it in such a rational and fair manner. I want to give a round of applause to you for having done it. My only goal is for people to understand the complexity of the issue and then take whatever position you want. But this is not an issue that warrants the kind of violence, the kind of irrational responses on both sides, on all sides. It's very emotional. We understand it. You know, the Jewish people have been through horrible, horrible experiences. My own family, many people here, their own family, and the Palestinian people have been through horrible, horrible experiences. And, you know, my goal, I don't know how many years the good Lord has left to give me, but if I could accomplish in my limited years some degree of rapprochement, that's why I take every opportunity to meet with people like Abbas, to meet with people like Fayyad, who used to be the prime minister, because I want to bring about a rapprochement, and that will mean compromise, and that will mean neither side gets what they want. And that's the end result. You know, a friend of mine just told me, well, of course the Palestinians turned down 1947, 1937, 1947, 1967, 2000, 2001. They didn't get a perfect deal. Of course they didn't get a perfect deal. They probably didn't even get a very good deal. And the Israelis felt they didn't get a very good deal. And so the question is, how much do you give up in the name of compromise? And the worst thing about Haj al-Husseini, joining this dialogue, was he turned what was a dispute over land, which is resolvable, into a dispute over what God, Allah, Hashem meant when he allocated land to these people or that people. You can't resolve those disputes because we don't have access to Allah. Right. We don't have access to Hashem. We don't have access to what the intention of the Bible was. The first Rashi, the great interpreter of the Bible, and the first word of Bereshit, the beginning, Rashi asked the question, why does this book deal with creation? It's a law book. And the answer given in 1,000 years ago was that because someday people will claim that the Jews have no right to Israel, and we want the world to know that God allocated the land to them. I'm not making that argument as a proof text. I'm making the argument to show how long the Jews have yearned for a return to their land and why it's so important to have a compromise. There is room for two peoples. There is room for a Palestinian state and for a nation state of the Jewish people. Let's all move in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
This giant 3 by 4 foot Thanksgiving word search is the perfect addition to your holiday gathering. It's got 50 Thanksgiving themed words.
What, in your view, are politically, given the current reality, politically feasible options
pathways to ensure that the Hamas power base isn't rebuilt in Gaza, and which actors need to be involved for that to happen?
What a great question. Brilliant question. And I'll start with an anecdote.
It's got to be a short one.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Carolyn and I were having dinner. This is a name dropping anecdote. Carolyn and I were having dinner with the then President Bill Clinton, and we were talking about the Middle East, and somebody railed against Israel, and Clinton started to answer, and I started to answer, and Bill said, "Let me answer." And he said, "There's only one problem with Israel." And everybody looked up. What's the problem? He said, "It's a democracy." Damn it. He said, "I can tell the Jordanians what to do, they'll do it. I can tell the Egyptians what to do, they'll do it. I tell Israel what to do, they'll say, well, we'll convene the small cabinet, the big cabinet. We'll get some public opinion polling. We'll then have a discussion in the Knesset. We'll then have a resolution in the Supreme Court. It's a democracy. Damn it." That's the problem. And the problem with Palestinian statehood is it will be a democracy. And if it's a democracy, then maybe the views that now seem to be a majority in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, which favor Hamas, may prevail. And so it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma between democracy, and democracy, by the way, is a means toward an end. It's not an end in and of itself. It's a means toward, Jefferson wrote about this and others have written about this. And the question is, Hitler was elected in a democracy. And 1932 in Germany, there was a democracy. He didn't get a majority, but he got a plurality. So the paradox is, if you want a democratic Palestinian state, how do you assure that that democratic Palestinian state doesn't become what it could become? By the way, the same question is true of Israel. With the growth of the right, and when I debated Peter Beinart once, he said, "Oh, Israel is moving to the right." I said, "Of course it is all my fault." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I helped bring 800,000 Russian Jews to Israel. I was one of the leaders of the Soviet Jewry movement. I was very instrumental in getting 800,000. And how do you think they voted? They all voted right wing. Why? If you live under if you live under communism, you're not going to vote left. And so when you have democracy, you can't dictate the results of the democracy. Yeah. That's why I think peace is going to be hard. It's going to be hard. A two-state solution is going to be hard. But we have to try it. It's the least worst alternative. And so I'm in favor of a two-state solution with a democratic Palestine, democratic Israel, and with people like us maybe influencing the people in Israel and the people in Palestine to move toward the center. That's the hope. That's the goal. And my hope and goal is to have more and more debates like this and more conversations like this. And I just want to thank you so much for bringing me back to Harvard. I was here 50 years as a professor. I taught 10,000 students. And I'm thrilled to be back.
It's 2025. America's debt is over $37 trillion, and the dollar just had its worst crash since 1973. That puts your savings and your family's future at risk. That's why we trust Alpha Omega Gold, a company that stands unapologetically with Israel and supports Stand Tall Israel. Visit ao.gold/stand to claim your free precious metals wayfinder guide, or call 1-855-426-4653 today. Protect your future before it's too late.
يعني سافدير buy gold, no?
Who was that was talking? Is that the ambassador you were